It's spring, but it's still cold in the morning. But we're gonna start our talk. I am one of the older generations of Gen Zs, and like many other Gen Zs, I do really appreciate personal space, emotional validation, and awareness of mental health. My best friend back home is a future psychologist, and we often discuss about this issue. A little bit personal, but when it comes to other people, we don't gossip. We don't judge people about their behaviors. And instead, we try to understand their background, childhood trauma, and situations that formed those behaviors. I think it's a very Gen Z thing to also see mental disorders with so much less of a derogatory view. We tend to break the taboos, unlearn our parents' and grandparents' denialism against mental health awareness, and instead we try to learn it with openness, working on breaking trauma chains. Yeah. Usually on weekends, I like to give myself time to do anything I feel like doing, just following where my heart goes and listening to my body. But for today's episode of Rumors from the Runes, I decided to listen to my mind because it wants to explore how people in the ancient Greece perceived mental issues and how they're different or similar to us today, how important were mental treatments, how did the basis of psychology and psychopathology emerge from hundreds of years before century. So welcome to my video essay. Only a few centuries before us, we see how madness was linked to superstitions, from evil spirit to detachment from God's grace. But little did we realize how the ancient civilization had a more advanced paradigm about mental health. In the 4th century BCE Asclepian temples, people used to worship a healing god named Asclepius. He was the son of Apollo with immortal women. His shrines in Kos, Epidaurian, and Peloponnese, for example, became the centers of scientific medicine. In the Epidaurian temple, there was a well-known elegiac couplet displayed on the portal, saying, "Pure must be the person who goes inside the sweet-smelling temple. Purity is to think holy thoughts." In 300 BCE, Asclepius cults were also extended to Rome and Tiber Island. So, who is Asclepius? Asclepius himself was a mythological figure that might also be historical due to the nature of Homeric writings in the 8th century BCE, which usually imagine cultural figures as heroes or demigods. The myth says that Asclepius was given 2 vials of blood by Athena from the jugular veins of Gorgon Medusa so that he could raise the dead and destroy them. The blood in this story portrayed the concept of pharmakon, which could be medicine or venom at the same time. In relation to the Homeric era, the Greeks had conceptualized the understanding about the soul, called psyche, and based on this concept, human emotions root from themos, influencing the physical activities of the body. Themos is located in the phrenes, where feelings takes place, while nous is the faculty of rational and intellectual thinking. Let's go back to the origin of this cult and how in practice they manifested Asclepius' healing power through the rites. It happened in the 2nd century AD when it was probably Hadrian who initiated the reconstruction of Hellenistic wonders, including the Asclepian temple in the outskirts of Pergamum, today in western Turkey, bounded by the coastline of the Aegean Sea. Today, it's a necropolis with remnants of Attic or Athenian style of funerary structures. There used to be a man named Archias, the son of Aristechmus, who was healed at the Epidaurian Asclepius temple after being injured while hunting. And he brought the cult to Pergamum in honor of Asclepius around 4th century BCE. Yet it was not until 3rd century BCE when the cult physically took shape under the patronage of King Eumenes I, who was the Pergamon king. Few centuries after, in the late antiquity, there was a record of a Greek orator, Elias Aristides, who reached the Asclepius temple for a healing retreat. It is discussed in a recent I read titled In Praise of Asclepius. Elias Aristides selected prose hymns that his reason could be either to treat his deteriorating health or his intention to reshape his oratorical profile. In addition to that, there were other recognized intellectuals who got linked with the Asclepian oniric rituals, including Socrates, Antisthenes, Euripides, and Xenophon. There was a tendency that healing cults like this demanded that their patients write their miraculous recovery journeys. Back then was known as therapia or yama, and that explains why Aristides wrote an account on his experience titled Hieroi Logoi. Unfortunately, I couldn't find the translated publication of this specific account yet, but I'd like to quote it from the aforementioned article I'm citing. It says, "In fact, there is very much that is paradoxical in the remedies of the god. For example, one man drinks gypsum, another hemlock, and another undresses and bathes in cold water with no need of warmth, as one would expect. Indeed, he has also honored us in this way by stopping catarrhs and cold with baths in rivers and sea, by curing our inability to lay in bed with long walks, by adding indescribable purgatives to frequent fasting, and by commending me to speak and write when I found it difficult to breathe, so that a people cured in this way can boast a little bit about it. We have too our share of boasting." This passage doesn't exactly mention strictly psychotherapy procedure, but I'll soon elaborate how psychological and somatic health were not necessarily disengaged in ancient Greek healthcare. Aristides believed that after paying a visit to the sanctuary of Asclepius, the god himself prescribed the cure to his illness through dreams. Mental illness was seen as medical and physical, and shows how there were already ancient groups who allowed people to explore their psychophysical individuality to treat psychosomatic diseases. Prescriptions that were sent to dreams were sometimes interpreted with the assistance of the physicians. So, why dreams? Apparently, dreams were seen as linked to the physical experiences involving many human senses, and while being unconscious, the body acted as a vehicle of the incarnation, which resonates with the psyche. From these dreams, Asclepian priests and the temple patron would administer physical treatments like bathing, exercises, the application of therapeutic emollients, and consuming potions. A different account found about the Asclepian cult was written by Julius Apelles, who wrote in the time of the priesthood of Publius Aelius Antiochus. Julius Apelles suffered from dyspepsia, so he went to the Asclepius temple in Epidaurian, where he got his treatments, of course, after paying his medical bill. And yes, there was a medical bill charged to the patients at that time. Medicines used in the healing center combine herbs, plants, and animal products. In Earth, Dream and Healing, the integration of materia and psyche in the ancient world, Jeffrey Pattis talks about 192 discovered Greek papyri about the psychosomatic healing practices in the Asclepius cult. So these papyri keep formulae of ancient remedies, and there was even a prescription to make you sleep easier for those with sleeping problems, consisted of mandrake root, water, honey, henbane, ivy ground, and measures of wine. The Asclepius temple also had a special connection with water. 2 centuries earlier, before the temple became official, they built a channel that could convey water to the feet of the cult statue, then flowing into an incubation stoa called the abaton. In Asclepius' rites, water was an important element for healing and purification. When it comes to practical remedies, though, other than exercises, art was an important element in the cult. For example, worshippers of Asclepius used to have musical, theatrical, poetic, and oratorical performances as a form of cultic therapy. Following the belief system that honored Asclepius, there was a practice more focused on mental health, and they called it therapia tes psyches, meaning cure of the soul, which Christopher Gill in his paper tried to link with our modern definition of psychotherapy. I mean, most scientific terms we commonly use now are derived from ancient Greek, so it shouldn't be surprising that it originated from them. Gill quoted Anthony Storr's definition of psychotherapy, which is the art of alleviating personal difficulties through an agency of words and a personal professional relationship. It usually involves sessions attended by a patient and a therapist. In modern psychotherapy, clients would be able to explore their feelings and being assisted to trace the roots of their traumas and upbringings and unravel them through this procedure. The healing cult of Asclepius inspired and expanded throughout the philosophical and medical communities. Simultaneously, these communities have revolutionized Asclepian healing into something more systematic and science-based as well. It was since the 5th century BCE that Alcmaeon, a philosopher and medical theorist from Croton, mentioned that brain was the central faculty of human intellect. In the following years, Hippocrates concluded that due to this notion, mental illness was then rooted from brain pathology. By the way, Hippocrates was one of the ancient scientists whose healing methods were very related to the Asclepian cult. He was a 5th century BCE father of medicine, whose treatises reached the Renaissance in their both Latin and Greek forms, around 1525 to 1526. On the island of Kos, Hippocratic doctors network in a guild called the Asclepiads. It was back then how they practically called the doctors, who often guided cult priests and pilgrims in their healing retreats. One of the Hippocratic texts, titled Epidemics, already contains descriptions of mental illnesses with different terms. And according to these texts, the line drawn between soul and body is blurry. They are not necessarily isolated from each other. Hippocratic researchers learned that the delirium and madness come from the brain. With that being said, mental illness was purely physical and not sacred, unlike the assumption of many witch doctors or faith healers. In the 2nd century AD, the Cappadocian Aristides recognized mania and melancholia as a condition which patients should be treated not to harm themselves and other people. A type of treatment for these illnesses was mentioned by Soranus of Ephesus in the 2nd century AD as well, that mental patients should be put in a quiet room with gentle colors, chantal music, and they must have access to bath. Beating and forceful restraints, on the other hand, were not seen as treatment, let alone remedy to mentally ill patients. Some medical substances like sedatives and hypnotic plants were used in particular conditions when it's necessary. So these signs of psychosomatic health developed until the late antiquity or early medieval era. And here I'd like to introduce you to a figure named Galen, or Claudius Galenus, a physician from Pergamum also. He later inspired the 4th to 5th century medical researchers. Galen wrote in the 2nd century AD, including 7 commentaries of the Hippocratic treatises, regarding him as one of the most eminent doctors and philosophers in that era. A paper by Chiara Tumiga in 2015 reviewed the Galen and Hippocratic texts through a linguistic approach. In the late antiquity and the early medieval era, there were already Hippocratic-based terms to diagnose mental patients through certain characteristics, such as leros, a mild rambling or talking nonsense, paraphrosin or general derangement, parecruse or being knocked off course mentally, exemane or the most violent form of maniacs, paraphora, being carried away, or paranoia, meaning the disordered thinking. Tumiga argued that Galen had oversimplified Hippocrates' text, which he assumed was ordering these illnesses according to their severity. This article didn't say much about therapy, but it tells us something about how careful tracking of mental symptoms could recognize the disease lead to. Rhetorical function of the doctors were also very important to support the mental well-being of the patients in order to also recover physically. They argued that without rigid taxonomy, Hippocratic physicians were actually so sophisticated that they could unfold the complexities of human condition. In general, most physicians influenced by Hippocrates did not separate mental conditions from bodily disorder. There was a patient named Apollonius from the city of Abdera, a municipality in today's Thrace, Greece. He suffered from liver disease, digestive failure, which might be caused by his poor diet. It was indicated by his irregular bowel movement and urine color, and at the same time, he displayed some mental symptoms like memory loss, confusion, screaming, and eventual raving madness. In the ancient times, physicians used to take mental symptoms as equal to physical, while in modern times, most of them were taken only as side effects. Mental conditions were so dynamic that Hippocratic doctors thought they're really important. In early stages, patients might ramble and then they start to be forgetful. Next time, they could be exploding out of mania and then followed by persistent delirium, which highly risking them to death. Now going back to the case of Apollonius, in the 24th day of his treatment, his physician practiced something called pareigoria. It could mean an attempt to console the patient, but it could also mean that the situation required urgent intervention. And later he was diagnosed with a condition named phrenitis, in which he was labeled as phrenetikos. So in Hippocratic concept, the mental disorder translates as an acute neuropsychiatric condition. The disease itself attacked phrenes, which was understood as the seat of thinking and located near the diaphragm. Phrenitis is severe, just like lethargus, which are indicated by extreme excitement and depression, and usually they're at a very extreme point. According to other physicians, Aretius and Soranus, who are, by the way, not strictly Hippocratic but shared some identical paradigms and recognition, melancholia and mania were also measured by the level and switch between the extreme excitement and depression. Within the parameters of diagnosis, the ancient Greek physicians didn't let go unnoticed signs like phobias, compulsions, delusions, hallucinations, and anxieties. And according to Hippocratic literatures, unsurprisingly, patients had various reasons to bear the mental conditions that they had. In the article of Israel Edward Drabkin, titled Remarks on Ancient Psychopathology, he collected some issues that patients had from the accounts of Hippocrates, Celsus, Aretius, Caelus Aurelianus, Galen, Athenaeus, and Elian. He wrote, "One patient identifies himself with Atlas, carrying on his back the weight of the world. Another believes that his middle finger supports the world and he binds it for fear that if he bends it, everything will collapse. Another imagines he hears flute players day and night. Another believes that he is an ex-tyrant who had been beheaded. Another that he has swallowed a snake. Another suffers from a compulsion, often attested also in modern texts, that forces him continually to wash himself. One patient is morbidly afraid of the sound of the flute at night. Another dreads caves. Another is unable to cross a bridge or walk alongside a ditch. Another, who has been frightened by suddenly finding a crocodile by his side, suffers amnesia and imagines that his left arm and leg have been bitten off. One patient identifies himself with a god, another with a great orator, another with an actor, another with a stalk of grain at the center of the universe, another with a baby wailing to be carried in someone's arms. Another imagines himself an earthen vessel and shuns people to avoid being broken. Another imagines himself a brick and refuses to drink to avoid dissolution. A wealthy patient is tormented by fear of impending poverty. Another patient is under the delusion that he owns all the ships in the harbor, and so on and on. Drabkin concluded a pattern that Hippocratic physicians mostly theorized that mental diseases were caused by the brain producing detrimental effects, triggering imbalanced physiological processes in other organ faculties. For example, the yellow bile and black bile of the four humors in excessive amount might cause anger and bitterness. Greek medical literatures also rejected supernatural intervention as a sufficient explanation of mental diseases. Not that they disbelieved the supernatural, but simply that it was not a part of the medical science. In the late antiquity, scientists have studied the brain, from Alcmaeon, Herophilus, Erasistratus to Galen himself, and their studies encompass the brain structure, the nervous system, and their functions. The philosopher Plato in Charmides also wrote one of his most cited works when it comes to mental health. The great error of our day in the treatment of human beings is that some physicians separate treatment of the soul from treatment of body. As an instance in modern psychiatry, disorders were divided into those that are organic and those that are functional. Diseases which causes can be traced or tangible, as in psychoses caused by infection, intoxication, and other bodily disturbances, are classified as organic, while functional diseases are assumed as being without tangible cause, be it neurosis, paranoia, schizophrenia, manic depression, and so forth. Looking up to the medical world of Hippocrates up to Galen, all mental disorders were organic. And with that being said, the treatment should also be somatic, besides the moral supports that I've already mentioned before. This comprehension was then passed to their successors, including Oripagius, Aetius, Paul of Aegina, and Alexander of Tralles. I was so excited when I found this interesting theme of ancient Greek history, and I'm so happy to talk about it in a video essay, especially since we have that much of old accounts that validated mental illness as something that requires medical therapies, and that it was indeed physical. Instead of blaming demonic possessions or a lack of faith, they would solve these issues as scientific matter. So, what do you guys think? Are mental illnesses real or not? Or are we just really making them up and labeling them with complicated terms? Are they somatic or are they purely emotional? I would like to know if you have alternative views from other philosophers, traditions, and even time periods. For example, as you know, in the medieval era, metaphysical approach was dominant even in the early modern times. So feel free to comment down below. Don't forget to like and subscribe, and see you on my next video. Bye!